And I decided today I was going to turn my normal speech a little on its head because after all, we're in Austin, right? So you got to do things differently. And I thought I'd start with the question I get most frequently from people in audiences like this that are made up of a lot of parents. How many parents in the room? So almost everybody. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about some tough topics today. I'm gonna talk about suicide and depression. I'm gonna talk about my own depression and suicide attempts, and also that I had electroconvulsive therapy in order to start my way on recovery. So what is the question that I get most frequently is, how do your kids feel about this topic, and how do they feel about you being so open about this topic? And how do you talk to them? So I'm going to tell you two little stories just to give you an answer to that question. The first is my son, who's now 20, when he was about 8 years old and I was working on my book, came home from school one day and said, "Mom, when you were depressed, did you think about killing yourself?" And I thought, okay, what do I tell to an 8-year-old? You know, I mean, this is, you know, is he going to be in psychotherapy for the rest of his life because of this? And so I thought, well, you know what? If this is a genetic disease, I need to be honest with him. I need to talk to him. And I said, "Daniel, yes, I thought about suicide." And so he thought for a minute, and he said, "So in the Great Depression, did everybody try to kill themselves?" And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me. The other instance that happened was when we moved to London when my daughter was in 6th grade. And she came, I didn't know a soul there, and after about 4 days in school, she came home and she said, "Oh, Mom, we were talking about mental illness and health today." And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." She said, "Oh, and I told everybody that you're mentally ill." but it's okay because you did that shock thing and everything's much better now. So, I mean, both those are great examples of how I was probably much more apprehensive about this topic than my children were. We've been talking about depression and mental illness for a long time. So, with the start of this new Jewish New Year, and I'm assuming a lot of people in the room are Jewish, I want to put before you a challenge on defying depression, because I think we can all do it. Val alluded to some of the statistics, but let me give you a few more. There are about 38,500 people annually in the United States who die by suicide. Now that number is kind of abstract unless you have a point of comparison. There are 40,000 people a year who die by breast cancer. So if you think about the awareness level, it's quite different for those two diseases. This is also a disease that heavily strikes for the young, for almost every demographic group. For those 15 to 25, it's the second highest cause of death. So these things are kind of depressing if you think about it, but the good news is depression, if caught early enough and if managed well, doesn't have to be that difficult to manage. And I really think that we can avoid a lot of suicide. In fact, I think if we start early enough and we start educating kids early enough about the symptoms of depression and how to take care of their brains, that we can cut those suicide numbers in half. And I've been saying that for a while now, but I'm looking to this group to really help me start implementing some of the change to do it. But the problem is we don't think about it and talk about it actively. And what I'd like to do is give you a little exercise to bring this point home. So I'd like everybody who brushed their teeth this morning to stand up. Okay, that is great. So I would like everybody who consciously did something today to protect their brain to sit down. Okay, so there's a few. Okay, everybody can sit down. But this is case in point. When you think about it, How many people know of someone who's died of dental decay? Not too many, but yet we have 38,500 people in this country alone dying by suicide. We need to do something about it. Why do I know so much about this? Well, in 2001, I attempted suicide 3 times. In September of that year, when I think most of us were watching 2 planes crash again and again into the Twin Towers, I was sitting in a locked psychiatric ward waiting for my first round of electroconvulsive therapy. I was certain my life was over. I was certain that I had nothing to offer my children, who were 5 and 7 at the time. I had nothing to offer my husband or my family, and I was so certain of this that I drove my car into the garage and let the engine run for 90 minutes. Now, luckily, my garage happens to be very well ventilated, which I did not know. Thank goodness. And so I'm here today because of that reason. So I ended up having ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, and has everybody heard of ECT? Okay. And for me, the results were miraculous, which I can remember after the first treatment, waking up the next morning, looking at my journal, and I've kept pretty detailed journals most of my life, and reading it and thinking, who is this person? And how could have I possibly been this negative about myself? And that's when this idea crystallized. Depression is a disease. Nothing in my life had changed. I had the same husband, the same kids, the same house, and yet all of a sudden I felt 180 degrees differently about this. So although I felt so much better, I was still concerned that if I didn't understand how this happened, I would be doomed to repeat the cycle. So I spent about 4 years in psychotherapy. I spent about a frightening long time, probably 8 years writing this book. And I've actually, since publishing the book, have talked to all kinds of people who told me that I was that when they were reading the book, they felt like I was writing about them. Now, what's interesting about this is I have had people like a middle-aged businessman, a teenage girl who had piercings and tattoos. I've had a young man in middle school. I've had folk singers. I've had artists. I've had all these different people telling me that they felt just the same thing I did, and it's kind of hard to imagine that all these people related to a affluent soccer mom with this book. And what that really brought home for me is that though the faces of depression are very, very different, the disease has some uniform tendencies that surround all of us. As Val so eloquently said, depression is an equal opportunity disease, and it can strike any one of us. So I went through my story. I've talked about the book, and I want to leave lots of room for questions. But one of the things that I think is very interesting since the passing of Robin Williams is I've noticed all sorts of things in the news, on social media, about depression and suicide and how terrible the problem is. The one thing I almost never see mentioned is how we stay well and how we take care of our brains. And so one of the things I've done is I have put 2 handouts on your table. One is for adults and one is for college students about things that we can do to keep our brain well. And I'm going to go and talk through that, and I'm making the mistake of giving you the handout while I'm speaking, so still keep listening to me. I'm going to add some things to it, so if you want to take notes on it, feel free to do that. Okay. So, and interestingly, I had someone ask me if I was an atheist because I quoted Darwin the other day. So. I do think Darwin is amazing, but it was kind of an interesting observation. Okay, so the number one thing that you can do to protect your brain is sleep. And one of the top characteristics of depression is either what is it? Insomnia, right? Or somebody sleeping all the time. Before I had depression, I just assumed that everybody who was depressed just slept all the time and never got out of bed. Some people don't react that way. For me, I have insomnia and I just can't shut down. So I notice, I watch my behavior, and what you need to do is watch your deviation from normal. So if your normal is 7 hours of sleep, and everybody's got a different normal, then be wary if you see a difference from that 7 hours. So for me, it is 7 hours. If I start sleeping 5 or 4 hours a night, a couple days consecutively, I actually take some medication to alter that until I get back into a steady state, and I allow that to correct itself. There's been some amazing research out of Harvard by a scientist named Stickgold. I don't know if anybody has heard of him, but he talks about the brain, and everybody knows what the prefrontal cortex is, right? This is what I call the nagging mother portion of the brain. This is the portion of the brain that tells you what behavior is socially correct, eat your spinach, all these things that it sort of keeps you in place in the black and white rules of society. When you go to sleep, that portion of the brain tends to go silent, and the limbic or emotional center of the brain comes alive. So if you think about if you're denying yourself sleep, you're denying yourself the ability to work through those abstract, difficult problems that you need to get through. Take a wild guess. Of the people who have major depressive disorder, how many of them do you think have sleep issues? 100, that's very close. So it's 90% of those who have that. You also find that if people have chronic insomnia, they are about 17 times more likely to have anxiety. They are also more likely to plan a suicide attempt and to attempt it. So sleep is really an important thing to guide for. The other thing is exercise. And this one I always put a caveat on. It's funny because I've been handing out this handout for about 2 years, and someone got it. I was on a show, I think 2 months ago, and I said something about only 150 minutes of exercise can help alleviate issues with depression. And I forgot to put a time qualifier on that. So this woman said, I'm trying to do 150 minutes of exercise a day. And she said, it's helping, but it's kind of getting in the way. So she was really fit by the end of the week, but you don't need to go 150 minutes a day. There's been some great research out of UT Southwestern that even with a minimal amount of exercise, that you can see a huge difference in depression. And also, people who exercise continually after they've passed through a depressive episode relapse at half the rate of those who don't. There was just an article this morning in the New York Times, I don't know if anybody saw it, about exercise and depression, and they were saying, I have a Struck by Living Facebook page, and I just posted it on it this morning, so anybody a Facebook user? Okay. So if you go to that page and like it, when I see articles, I put them up all the time. And this one is talking about an enzyme that is released when you exercise that they think activates something in the brain that helps you fight depression. So there's been a ton of research on that. The other thing that I discovered through this is I take a small amount of medication every day. And in 2005, I decided that I was spiritually whole. I had read all these spiritual writers who said that if you are spiritually whole, you do not need antidepressant medication. And so I went off medication. I don't know if has anybody experienced that with a loved one where they're doing fine on their medication and they go off? Well, I was one of those people. Now, I wasn't even having any side effects from the medication, but there was this thing about I did not want to be taking medicine. So I went off medication, I relapsed. I was in complete denial of the relapse until one of my friends basically shook me and said, if I have to shove the medication down your throat, you're going to take it. and I ended up having to do ECT again. So the big thing that I would urge you, if someone is taking medication, before you consider getting off, please consult with your psychiatrist, and be tolerant of those who are on medication. Because I think I still have people who tell me today, well, if you just did this more, you wouldn't have to be on medication. And I don't know, people don't go around and tell people to get off their heart medication or other things, but I have people still tell me that today. And I said, no, thanks, I've relapsed, I'm not going to do it. The other thing that I have learned is the impact of alcohol on depression, which for me was a big lesson. In fact, I had this interesting situation a couple of months ago, well, about a year ago, where I noticed that I was incredibly depressed every Saturday. And I thought to myself, okay, there isn't something bad happening every Saturday. This is kind of crazy. I mean, let's try to figure this out. So what I did is I noticed that on Friday mornings, I usually get up at about 5:30 in the morning, and I run with a friend. I was forgetting to take my antidepressant, which happens to be a dopamine-based antidepressant. Then what was happening is Friday night, I'd have a couple glasses of wine. What happens with wine or any kind of alcohol or drugs is your dopamine increases. That's why we all like it and it feels good, but then it crashes at twice the rate. And then the next thing I was doing on Saturdays, it was my only day off from exercise. Again, exercise increases the dopamine in your brain. So between those three things, I had put myself in a dopamine-deprived state. And dopamine is the chemical in your brain that allows you to experience pleasure. So what I did is I just put my medication out in the morning to make sure I wouldn't forget it, cut back on my alcohol consumption, and presto, like within a week, the problem was corrected. So I'd encourage all of you to be a scientist of your own behavior. I think a lot of times we depend so much on psychologists and psychiatrists to tell us what to do to correct our behavior. And the problem is you're only seeing these people for an hour a week or even less than that. It's hard for them to figure out what's going on in your life. But if you take the initiative to look at your own life and figure it out, then a lot of times you'll be better off. Some of the other things I'm going to do, and I want to make sure I have plenty of time for questions and answers, so you can let me know. We've got about 30 more or 10 more minutes. Okay. What I'm going to do, you have the list here, so I'm going to maybe do 2 more, and then let's open it up for question and answers. Does that sound fair? Okay. So if you skip to the back side, some of these are pretty obvious. The one thing, if you looked at the couple things that may not be obvious to you, that were sort of hard lessons for me, are number 7, brain engagement, and number 8. So what I mean by that is, as a young mother, what I tended to do was constantly put things that mattered to me on the back burner. So I love plays, I love museums, I love to read, and I kept on saying, oh, that's not really important, that doesn't need to get done, that doesn't need to get done. And what happened is I was basically killing myself by 1,000 cuts. So what I try to do now is I try to set aside some time every month that I get to do something that's excites my brain, something out of the box, something interesting. And there's a great show in Dallas right now, Rocky Horror. If any of you go up to Dallas, I'd really encourage you to go. But it was crazy. I dressed up in fishnets and very dampy. And it was just, I had a really hard week, and it was such an incredible release. And what I found is the things that I had been having a hard time doing prior to that release, all of a sudden got easier. So I'd really encourage you to do that. The other thing is this idea of avoid this age escalation gap, our trap. One of the things that happens in our culture is I think we tend to hang out with people in our same age group. and then we get trapped in the problems of that age group. So whether, can I get what is the thing that people in your social group talk about and you get so wound up about? Can I have an example? Where are you going to go to college? Okay, so I'm right there. My daughter's a senior in high school. She's trying to figure out where to go. So we'll have people say, well, how's she doing on her ACT? How's she doing on SAT? Where's she going to apply? Is she going to apply early? I would get so uptight listening to all the parents from the school that my child went to that I end up having a lot of anxiety about it. So what I do is I go to this place called the Cooper Center. And at the Cooper Center, there's this guy named Irving Adelstein, who's 86 years old. And he just has this incredibly great attitude. And also in the Cooper Center, you can go into the women's locker room, and I understand it's very different in the men's locker room. Sorry, guys. But if you go in the women's locker room and if you put out a problem, like I'm worried about my kid getting into college, you all of a sudden have all this input from women from all different age groups. As you're all sitting there in your bra and underwear, blow drying your hair. And it's just an amazing thing to say, oh, where's my kid going to get into college? To hear somebody who's 20 years older than you say, oh, you know what, I was so worried about that. My kid got into college, then they dropped out. I thought it was the worst thing in the world. Then they ended up starting this business, and everything worked out. So if you don't have a friend now who's 20 years older than you, I suggest that you try to find somebody like that. Okay, and I actually had, I did this talk one time, and there was an older woman in the audience, and she goes, they're all dead. So, anyway, then I told her just go younger. So I can get around that either way. But anyway, those are some of the things. You can see the other items here, and I could talk in more detail about them if there's one that strikes your interest. But what I'd like to wrap up with is a story about a hike I took one time that for me really created a visual metaphor for what depression is. Back in 2005, I went on a Sierra backpacking trip. Don't ask me why I thought I could do this. I'd never spent the night backpacking before, but for me that's never an issue to stop doing something. So I went with two friends, and I hauled a 35-pound pack. And about 3 days into the hike, it was raining really hard, and we had to do a river crossing. And this was in the middle of nowhere. It was a log going across a river, and I was pretty apprehensive about it. I had this big pack on. I was trying to figure out how to manage. And I got over it, but it was nerve-wracking because it was a slippery log. So I got to the other side. Then about 3 days later, we reached the source of the river. And at the source of the river, I could just step over it. And that's when I had one of these aha moments where I thought, this is exactly like my depression. If I can catch my signs early enough, if I can self-correct and get help, then all I have to do is step over the problem. And it's not that difficult. It's when I deny the problem, when I wait, when I don't do anything, that it grows into this raging river where it becomes really dangerous. So one thing I'd like to do, I do in all my talks, is to give you a call to action. And I'd like to do a couple things. I'd like all of you, when you go home today or sometime over the weekend, think about what you need to do to stay well. Oftentimes we wait until we're sick to think about what we need to do to stay well. And when you do that, you're in this constant state of catch-up. So that's number one. Think about what you need to do to stay well, write it down, and protect that list. Number two is talk to your kids about this. How many people have kids going off to school and you've talked about don't drink and drive, have safe sex, or don't have sex at all, depending on what, I won't get into that discussion. But, we have discussions like this. Well, you know what? their potential for suicide is actually higher than both those two things. So you need to think about, talk to them about what they need to do to stay well, and don't wait until they're at college to do it. I do a lot of talks with the University of Notre Dame, and these kids constantly look at me stunned as though they've never heard this information before, like sleep is really important. And I know all the parents here have talked to their kids about it, but talk about it in terms of mental health. That's really important. And the final action item I'd like to give to you today is to be kind to each other. When somebody is deeply depressed, oftentimes you can't see it, and the power of a kind word or a hand on the shoulder or just some kind thing that you say to them can move people from isolation to inclusion, and who knows, you might even save a life. So thank you, and I'd love to open it up to questions.